Okay, thank you. So welcome to everybody, and welcome to all you bring to our conversation today. Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, CPA Responds. So I'm Kate, CPA's current On Secretary, and I'm hosting and keeping time. I want to begin, I don't quite know how to do this. I feel like we need a kind of ritual or something, but the context in which we meet, and just the heat and the fires in Canada at the least, and the Guardian calling out climate crimes on Wednesday. American petroleum giants face a reckoning. And of course there's many other things I could say there. And I want to begin acknowledging the different kinds of tears in the making and responding to this book as well. CPA had its first event as CPA 10 years ago. I mean, it was coming into being before that first event. And that's kind of bittersweet, I realised this morning as I was thinking about it. But we're needed, and this book is needed, and I'm grateful. So welcome to Sally Weintrobe, author of the book Integral to CPA since its beginning. Welcome to Nadine, Judith, Paul and Adrian, who'll be giving responses to the book. Welcome again to all of you. Thank you for letting us record the event for others. It's part of ongoing discussion in CPA, and the recording will be on our website in due course. There will also be a recording of the Bloomsbury book launch on Sally's website in due course, and that involved other CPA members. And I suppose in some sense we began our response with Chris Robertson and Vivi Carnero's workshop in our community day, which as a workshop wasn't recordable, but there are thoughts and follow-up from that being gathered. And yesterday there was a fantastic conversation in our Google group, about the themes of the book. So I know not all of you are from CPA, but I hope you'll feel tempted to join us if you're not. And so the plan is that Adrian will begin, and then Judith, and then we will have time in breakout rooms for reflection, and then followed by Paul and Nadine, and then Sally to respond to all. And then we'll have another session in breakout rooms, and then come back for plenary discussion. So there's not space for questions and comments in amongst all of that, but please put them in the chat, because then we can gather them up at the point of plenary. So without further ado, I'll go on to introduce Adrian, who of course is known and much loved by many of us, I mean all of us in CPA, co-founder of CPA with Paul, and was CPA on SEC until 2018. And though no longer on the board, is still writing and researching and giving his careful attention to all of us within CPA. I wanted not just to have roles. So Adrian cornered, he told me about being his keen food grower and winemaker, along with his ongoing deep involvement with environmental projects in Somerset. So Adrian, it's lovely that you begin for us as co-founder. Can I hand over to you? And I will make sure, I think we are all muted, but I will double make sure that.
Thank you very much, Kate, and good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is to all of you. And I'd just like to start off by thanking Sally very much for asking me to participate. It's an honour to be involved and to have this chance to play a part in CPA's 10th birthday. And I'm going to speak directly to you, Sally, although this is obviously to everyone too. In my view, your book is a personal tour de force and a landmark in climate psychology. It's strongly argued, richly referenced, and written with a passionate heart as well as a keen mind, which makes it vibrant. And its colloquial style, coupled with short chapters, makes it reader-friendly, despite the complex ideas you're exploring. I see you as one of the pioneers of climate psychology as a transdisciplinary, that's to say, eco-psycho-social project. At the recent book launch, you were asked about the motivation behind it, and you mentioned your love of detective fiction, the whodunit and why. In the context of climate's ecological breakdown, I think the answer's a bit like Murder on the Orient Express. We all done it to some degree because we're children of the age of fossil fuels and ecocide. So we have to look inwards as well as outwards for the psychological roots of the climate crisis. But we're involved in such differing ways and degrees. The forensic work of the book looks in depth at who the chief architects are in perpetuating the crime, even as its enormity becomes ever clearer. You reveal that it's an architecture with many interacting dimensions. Going back to Head and Heart, one thing praised at the launch was the book's courage. An example of this, I think, is in your naming one chapter, The Power of Love, although it is a natural development of your long-standing theme of care and uncare. This part of the book, for me, opens up some interesting pathways that I want to try to explore as my contribution today. The Power of Love chapter, in the section, What Contains Exceptionalism, has in it a quote from Shakespeare's tragedy Macbeth, where he uses the phrase, the ravelled sleeve of care. My first thought, hardly an original one, was that care tends to unravel when a problem goes beyond self, family, or in some sense our tribe. The old point that the earth is too big, too abstract, too distant for many of us to feel a personal involvement with it still applies, I think. The sense of distance is being increasingly challenged by events and people, although it remains pervasive. But I want to move on from this cognitive stuff and try to connect with the whole of self spirit of the book. When I read the words of Macbeth, which culminate in that phrase, I was jolted onto a different track, which was as much about being in the field of climate psychology as using it to look at the world. I'll read the lines. We should bear in mind that they come hard on the heels of Macbeth having murdered Duncan, the king. He says, methought I heard a voice cry, sleep no more. Macbeth does murther sleep, the innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care. These words lead me towards a sense of a spectrum of care, beyond the polarity of care and uncare. When I say spectrum, I'm thinking as much of colours as of gradation. I do recognise the importance of the opposition of care, uncare, with all its links to pleasure and reality, greed, exception, narcissism, entitlement, and omnipotence, which you elaborate. But in a way, my track here is a fugue on the seemingly never-ending struggle that care entails. I find myself starting to think about some of the words and phrases involving care, which express truthfully, or sometimes deceitfully, different states of mind in which we dwell and from which we operate. Taking care, carefree, careless, couldn't care less, careworn, not a care in the world, beyond caring. What do we care about? Some of these words and phrases hint at the burden of care, innocence of it, acceptance, rejection or refusal of it, being weighed down by it or not feeling able to carry it anymore. We may not be subject to persecutory guilt, which Macbeth and his wife suffered as a result of personal ambition, having overcome care for others. But even reparative guilt, given the scale and intractability of our collective wrongdoing, can be a heavy burden. Your book, and climate psychology more widely, demands awareness of the crushing burden we collectively place on the earth and on those with fewer choices about how they live. One of the things which the book takes us into, relentlessly but carefully, is the fake carefree, the careless and couldn't care less world of refusing to have anything to do with guilt or grief. I recall here Greta's boat journey across the Atlantic. Speaking from that uncare part of the spectrum, the commentator Julia Hartley-Brewer defiantly stated that she wasn't going to feel a twinge of guilt about her next flight. And the thuggish Aaron Banks observed that accidents do happen at sea. These are striking examples of your point that neoliberal culture is downright dismissive of anyone who challenges our entitlement to keep right on consuming and laying waste. Rather late in assembling these thoughts, it hit me that I've been skirting round something. Macbeth is a reminder that we humans are a murderous species. It's not all we are, but it's very dangerous to forget that it's part of what we are. Distance isn't just a cognitive issue, it's a mechanism for keeping noses clean while other people, other life, and the future are destroyed. The examples I've given hint at a refusal to acknowledge destruction or murderous impulse, dressing them up as normal, healthy, or innocently humorous. I think that normalizing is rooted in colonialism, which portrays theft, invasion, and devastation as progress, because we are exceptional. The so-called civilized world gives us many opportunities to overlook the iniquities of the system from which we benefit. Distancing is a trick. New evidence emerged just this week that ExxonMobil's perverse and psychopathic behavior in undermining climate action is very much alive and kicking. Actual murder, too, is happening all the time. For instance, defenders of the Amazon jungle are apparently being killed at the rate of 1 every 48 hours. We have more than one kind of jungle to worry about. So, how do we all sleep at night? There's the dissociative sleep, which I see as a feature of what you call planet Lala, a very different state from the restorative sleep, the need for which Shakespeare knew well. Perhaps one function of climate psychology is as a community of the careworn. I'm not suggesting that your book is intended as medicine for the ache of care, but in its own act of care, I think it does help to strengthen the bonds which connect us up and enable us to stay with the trouble as much as we can bear to, but also to recuperate when we need to, even as we mourn what is being lost. We can be beyond caring and still return from that place. The other pathway opened up for me by your theme, the power of love, is the reminder that despite all the irreparable harm being done and the forces which deaden care, our capacity for care and its capacity to break through is strong. One way you illustrate that is when you say, and I'm condensing a bit here, neoliberals spent heavily on a culture to deregulate because they had to, their problem being that people do care. You certainly don't pull your punches over the difficult future we're facing or the psychological and political mountain we have to climb if we're to have a chance of reining in the harm. But I think you're urging us to see that our deeply embedded capacity for care, though burdensome, isn't just a burden, but is intrinsic to our humanity and the possibility that active care will find a renewed place in an economic and political system degraded by acquisitive and predatory values. I'll end by returning briefly to that key argument in the book that we all have a capacity for care and for uncare, and that politicians reflect and amplify the contradictions and betrayals which this gives rise to. You instance David Cameron with his hugger-husky and fanfare of the greenest government ever, decaying into irritation at all the green crap. I think Maggie Thatcher was an even starker example. You rightly identify her as one of the promoters in chief of neoliberalism, but with her science background, she was also the first major political leader to publicly acknowledge the climate threat and was instrumental in founding the Hadley Centre. There's no reason I'm aware of to doubt that the concern was genuine as far as it went, but it seems to have stayed in some compartment in her mind where it didn't have to come up against her economic and political views. A cautionary tale, I think, with some relevance to the behaviour of the current UK government and others. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for that fugue on the never-ending struggle. And the idea of the book as an act of care, and can we let ourselves be cared for, I suppose, as well. Judith is next. So Judith is a member of CPA and its executive committee and board from the beginning, and is our current chair and key curator of our Culture of Care and indeed this event. Judith works in York as a Jungian psychotherapist and energy psychotherapist and supervisor, and I've put when she's not striding out across Yorkshire or looking after grandchildren, and there is a kind of grandparent theme perhaps here as well. But Judith, welcome. Can I hand over to you?
You need to unmute, Judith.
Thank you, Kate, and apologies for... I was deeply relieved the other day when Sir David King had to be reminded to unmute. I'm going to talk about two main responses I had to this book. The first about exceptionalism and the second about accessibility of ideas. But my mind too is with our 10-year anniversary, and it is no accident that Sally was one of the responders in that meeting. And I can see how that paper she gave, which is probably still available on our website, had early threads of what she has ended up crafting into this book. When I was thinking about how to respond, a quote about interpretations in the therapy room came to my mind. The more to the point and more penetrating the interpretation, the more obvious it will be that the therapist is talking and understanding from the depth of his or her own psychological life. It takes one to know one, and in his or her correct interpretation, the therapist reveals that he or she is one. I have found this book very moving to read. At times I found myself unexpectedly close to tears. And I think the main reason for this is that in her writing about exceptionalism, Sally weaves together a critique of that phenomena in the personal and in the political. So the book doesn't let me off the hook for considering my own exceptionalism. At the same time, as strongly speaking truth to power when it comes to the exception in political leaders and systems in relation to both climate change and wider social justice considerations. And so, as I share these critiques with Sally when she writes about them trenchantly, and my rage and frustration with the political crazy, I cannot but keep an eye on my own participation. I think the particular quality that enables one to have that double vision is that the weaving of the personal and the political critique is done with deep compassion, and in that sense is infused with a culture of care, as Adrian has emphasised. We can know this in part because of moments of explicit self-revelation in Sally's book, but also there is something in the tone of the writing that leads one to feel that Sally knows this part in herself. She works on it. She knows its trickery. And she's found a place of compassion towards herself from which to stand, which enables her to gift this to us. Sally writes about Pick's way of conveying thoughtfulness for the two babies inside us, the caring part and the inner exception. There's an importance for leaders to give people's reparatory parts a home. They must try to help people to contain their inner exception as well. And this involves paying attention to the kind of anxieties that exceptional part will no doubt be feeling. I found myself wondering about that this week, when within 2 days of his appointment, our new health secretary in the UK spoke about our rights to have freedom, without, it seems, speaking to the potential hubris of this, or addressing the other part that might have aspirations to accept a lack of freedom for the sake of others. I'm reminded of a Cherokee saying, "There's a battle of two wolves inside us all. One is evil, it's anger, envy, greed, arrogance, jealousy, resentment, lies. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, humility, kindness, empathy, and truth." When asked which wolf wins, the answer is the one you feed. So how do we feed lively entitlement? I think this book nourishes through its compassionate truth-telling, and also shows how we may be able to nourish ourselves, others in our groups, our communities, our countries, and powerful organisations. The hints are there. Create space for feelings. Enable complexity of thought and feeling. Caroline Hickman writes about bearing and living with the biodiversity of emotions. And I think Sally is coming from that same place. We need to understand we come from a divided self. And there's also the suggestion to speak to the fears beneath our grandiose His or Her Majesty the baby selves. On to accessibility. One of the things I most love about this book is its use of language. Within Climate Psychology Alliance, we hold what I find myself quite a tricky balance between creating spaces to think and theorize in our often complex language, and at the same time needing to make our thinking accessible. Hence some of our activities, such as Through the Door or the Climate Cafe, really include the need for accessible language. And this week in our Google discussion spaces, we've been thinking what about the place of no hope if hope is unrealistic? Also, how do we hold ourselves to account, as well as the oil companies who have been merchants of doubt? And sometimes I have fantasies about us needing a translation department at the end of these wonderful discussions we have. How could we frame this to civil servants, to the local environment group, or perhaps to people regularly having to use food banks who know quite a bit about hopelessness? How can we make our psychological language work? It is often the beginning therapist who may make over-complex formulations. Can we bear to be in the therapy world that Mallon describes, where a client responds to a therapist's interpretation, my best friend or my partner or my secretary has been telling me that for years? Sometimes, of course, that is dismissive trivializing, but at other times there's a deep recognition that the truth of oneself has been in plain sight all these years. So just maybe we'd better look at the hymn sheet that people are singing from. So in this book, the words care and uncare resonate, like the Cherokee idea of two wolves inside. Exceptionalism resonates, lively exceptionalism resonates, crazy resonates. And in the form of the book, short chapters resonate, spiraling around topics resonate. One of the reasons for me that this is important is that we can very easily speak about a subject like climate collapse, forgetting that there are communities in this country who've known about collapse for decades, and perhaps we need to listen to their expertise and language. And even more importantly, there are communities in other parts of the world that we can easily choose to ignore, who are all too aware of climate collapse as a lived experience now, not as a future threat to wealthy, largely white-dominated nations. So my hope, Sally, for you and this book is that it will resonate across sectors and internationally. I hope its ideas can be brought into diverse forums, and I hope those of us who speak to different groups can use its ideas and perhaps more importantly, in its approach. So how do we speak to our local councils, our neighbourhood groups, scientists, parents, youth, schools? Here are some clues. Short sections digested, ordinary yet very powerful language, an appreciation of inner conflict, a good dose of me too, and above all compassion, speaking truth to power, both systemic power and our powerful inner struggles. So my invitation to those of you present today who haven't read the book, please do. And if you've read it again, embed the ideas, use it as inspiration to translate your own thinking in the same way. Back to the wolf analogy. In Sally's writing, both wolves need feeding. The deadening exceptional self, feeding with courageous truth and attention to underlying fears and who knows what else. And the lively exceptionalism with gratitude, with community, with support. And thank you so much for the support that this book brings, Sally. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you to the wolves and the resonance. You're now all going to go into breakout rooms. Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to move on to our second two people responding to the book, and then to Sally. And the first person to speak now, and again, please do put stuff in the chat so we can gather it up in the plenary as it goes. So the person to speak now is Paul, who's co-founder with Adrian of CPA and chair until 2018. previously Professor of Social Policy at UE and still working as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, author of a good few books, and at the moment writing another one. I'm going to add that Paul is a Skittles player. Welcome, Paul. Can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Kate. It's great to be here and on this occasion, and delighted to be able to contribute something to Sally's brilliant book that many of us have read. One of the things I've just loved about the book that both Judith and Adrian have already mentioned is the way in which Sally can make really complex psychoanalytic ideas lively and accessible. And one of the ways she does this in the book is by kind of these kinds of imaginative improvisations where she attempts to get inside the mind or that part of the mind and sort of draw it out in this kind of imaginative way. And there's one bit of the book where I found this absolutely stunning, the way in which Sally did it. And this was about the section on Noah's Ark and the 4 different responses or ways of responding to what she called archism. And in 3 pages, I felt Sally kind of summarized and in a condensed and illuminating way what other people, maybe myself included, would take a whole book to explain. And I just wanted to sort of recite one bit of this kind of imaginative riffing that Sally does at times, which I just found so powerful. And this is where she talks about the mind of the exception in terms of the super rich, the mega wealthy. And I think this is important because it is this 0.1% who are in control of our destinies in many ways at the present moment in time. And so it's really important that we begin to understand that state of mind, both in them and in us. So here she goes. This is one of these imaginative extracts. Earth is ruined and doomed, no longer the paradise I deserve. So it's time to leave. The best place to live is probably Mars, a pristine planet, but I'm not crazy. I know Mars is not livable. So our next task is to put money into space research and make it livable. For now, I'll buy 1 more property upstate, so climate instability will hit me and mine less hard in the shorter term. And another property in New Zealand for when it hits very hard. I know it must. I had better get my skates on, as others have the same idea and prices will soon rise. My key psychological task now is to build better protection against any inner emotional climate disturbance and instability. What if I feel sad to see the earth ruined? Oh, no, bury that thought. The future is a bright, shiny place. No grieving there. I must be even more machine-like, bright, smart, and only optimistic. On my ark, I can finally leave all the difficulty of being human. The mess, the conflict, the damage, the guilt, infirmity, inadequacy, and dreaded dependency on nature for life itself. Leave all that behind. What a relief. I'm a new type of human, an alpha type, and we alphas are now poised to take over, aided by machines and high tech. Isn't life fun? Alpha humans will in time be able to conquer the limits of death, time, and deep space. Betas and the rest will be superfluous. Earth can be their graveyard. I'm excited to live at a time when people can finally shake off the limitations of being human. I glow in triumph, and in that state I despise those left behind. Chiefly, I despise my own animalness. humanity, and that part of me that cared. I was starting to become unendurably tormenting. Thank goodness I've finally ditched it. Now, I think that is just a fantastic kind of imaginative exploration of this kind of part of the mind, which not only we know through writing that's been done actually exists in the mega wealthy and rich at the present moment in time. These things are actually being thought of quite actively. But we also can see this in our patients and clients in our consulting rooms, and we know it exists in ourselves. And I think through these kinds of imaginative walks that Sally takes us on, she captures something so sharply and pointedly that you'd have to be mad not to be affected by it. And of course, a lot of people therefore won't be affected by it because they are pretty mad, unfortunately. Now, when Sally refers to the alpha types, of course, she's referring to the exceptions. And in the kind of thinking I've been doing over the last few years, it's the Übermensch, what Nietzsche referred to as the Übermensch, the overman. Yeah? And they look down on the little people. Yeah? The little people are us. Yeah? And there's one rule. This is one of the key things about exceptionalism. There is one rule for them, and there is another rule for us. The exception in me feels exactly the same thing, but I'm accepted from rules that apply to others, and I know applies to others, but they don't apply to myself. And one of the key ways in which this finds manifestation today is in taxation, obviously. You know, that taxation is something that only applies to certain individuals. There's a classic American billionaire called Leona Helmsley, who was a bit of a role model for Donald Trump, who once said about taxation that it's only the little people who pay taxes. So this is a way in which the Übermensch, the alpha types, think. But there's a statement there that Sally makes at the end of that imaginative excursion of hers. She says, "Chiefly I despise my own animalness, humanity, and the part of me that cared." And this gets this heart of, I think, something about the white Judeo-Christian civilized complex that most of us are a part of, which forms this kind of hubristic exception in all of us, because there's a part of us that does despise this animalness in us, and therefore also despises our own humanity, because it's our fragility and vulnerability which is in that animal, finite, mortal nature. And so to the extent that we despise those things, we're becoming inhuman. Yeah? And we know that once people start to become inhuman, that the greatest crimes that we're capable of are committed. And again, one of the people I'm reading over and over again these days is Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. And I'm sure Sally was influenced by her thinking when she refers to superfluousness, because this is one of Hannah Arendt's key terms, that we cannot understand what happened in the Holocaust and so on without understanding the way in which this notion of superfluousness takes hold in the minds of people gripped by these kinds of omnipotent, mad kinds of ways of thinking. And that's our great threat at the present moment in time. That as this climate and ecodiversity crisis deepens, as Sally says precisely in her imaginative exploration, a large group of powerful people are beginning to decide that large sections of humanity are superfluous. Yeah? And the start of that slippery slope we can see in the way in which we're thinking about climate migrants already. So I'll stop there, but huge thanks to this book I think it's going to have a profound impact on people and their way of thinking, and not just those involved in climate change. I think it's actually going to affect clinicians and the way in which they begin to think about their work as clinicians as well. So, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. There's so much in that, and just caught by the clinicians at the end, because one of the feelings I had with the book is I just wanted to give it to all the trainees I work with in terms of understanding that. Nadine, now, can I invite you to come in? And so Nadine is chair of CPA Scotland, a psychosocial researcher, mindfulness and nature connection teacher, and a mountain leader, qualified mountain leader, which I love the idea of you off up the mountains, Nadine. Also visiting researcher at Lancaster University, Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business. So over to you, Nadine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So what I'm going to be doing in the next 10 minutes or so is pretty different to what you've been hearing so far. So hold on as best you can. So about 50 of conflict. And there was something that the trainer said then that made a big impression on me, which was this: life is not in conflict. Life is not in conflict with itself. It is in balance. So when we experience conflict, it's because we are in conflict with life. And this is what came to my mind when I was reading Sally's book, because it has at its core the idea that there is within all of us this conflict going on between the caring and the uncaring parts of the self, this power struggle, where uncare is like a wild animal that needs to be reined in by care. So in my response, I want to explore, to depart from the book and explore ways of conceptualizing and experiencing this relationship that's not so much about conflict, and drawing particularly on Taoist philosophy, because Taoism is concerned with how to be in harmony with life. And I first came across, I got interested in Taoist philosophy in the early 90s, and I've been practicing a Taoist physical art practice for a long time as well. So that has very much kind of influenced my thinking. But what I want to do first is actually to refer to social psychology theory on self-transcendence and self-enhancement values and intrinsic and extrinsic goals, which is based on empirical research, which I think overlaps and uncare to the extent that self-transcendence values and intrinsic goals include care for others, so they go beyond individual self-interest. Self-enhancement values and extrinsic goals are to do with power over others, achieving external rewards such as financial success and positive evaluation by others. So this is theory which I worked with a lot when I was doing my PhD. Now, we know from all these studies that the more strongly individuals subscribe to values beyond their own immediate self-interest, the more likely they are to engage in pro-environmental behaviour. And conversely, self-enhancement values and extrinsic goals are associated with less concern for the welfare of others and nature, and are also associated with higher materialism. Now, in that literature, self-enhancement values are understood to be anxiety-based. They're understood to be self-protective values pursued to cope with anxiety in situations of uncertainty, whereas self-transcendence values are understood to be anxiety-free. And whereas intrinsic goals are inherently satisfying to pursue, which means, they satisfy basic psychological needs of competency, relatedness, and autonomy. Extrinsic goals are pursued as a means to some other end, or to compensate for a deficiency in satisfying these needs, and to compensate for psychological insecurity. So in self-determination theory, it's through satisfaction of these basic psychological needs that we experience psychological well-being. Now, it's thought that people have both sets of these values, and indeed a whole lot of other values available to them, but people might have dispositional tendencies to prioritise some over others, some values over others, and these tendencies are gained through accumulated experience, can change over time, and we can also be unconsciously primed into activating certain values, such through advertising. In that literature, there's also an understanding that people seem to make trade values within an integrated system. So a particular value might be in line with one, a particular behaviour might be in line with one value but in conflict with others, and therefore that behaviour is not enacted. Now, in keeping with how Sally conceptualises the relationship between care and uncare, these two sets of values, the self-transcendence and the self-enhancement, the intrinsic and the extrinsic goals, are modelled in the literature as being organised in the mind as in oppositional conflict to each other, like a seesaw. So that when one set of goals or values is activated, the other is suppressed. And this way of conceptualising or to pursue behaviours congruent with both sets simultaneously. Now, when I was doing my PhD 9 years or 10 years ago or whatever, and I was first engaging with all of this social psychology theory, I got really intrigued by this kind of oppositional way that it was being modelled, the way that they appeared to be structured, and the degree to which this was actually innate, which is what some scholars held. Ways of experiencing and conceptualizing these values, and that's, I'm going to return to that work now. So I was really pleased to be asked to respond to this, because it gave me a reason to kind of re-engage with all that thinking, which I've not thought about for ages. So to do that, I want to just share my screen, because I'm very into diagrams, and it helps me think and express. So I'm just going to, there's a slide which I want to share now. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that, and if not, someone can wave at me or something. So basically this is being structured as polar opposites, which is like in a two-dimensional world. So it's either or, win and lose. In this kind of case here, there might be some sort of unhappy compromise somewhere along there. And an alternative way of thinking about this duality is with this concept of yin and yang. And here, care and uncare are not absolutes. Each would contain an element of the other, and there's dynamic interplay between them, which would mean that care attracts, evokes, and transforms uncare, and that uncare attracts, evokes, and transforms care. And also, importantly, that there's a greater whole from which both care and uncare derive. So there's a meta position of non-duality. And that meta position, then, is where conflicts are transcended. And so that's the three-dimensional perspective. So there's a kind of win-win, both and sort of thing going on. And in the top right corner, what I've labelled as adaptive non-duality is where there's some sort of healthy synthesis that's happened. So perhaps we're able to harness uncare in service of care, and vice versa, to create something else. There might be an easing of the anxiety underpinning uncare, and there could also be learning which we can acquire by going through care. So there's it's like the coin of which care and uncare are the two sides. So, you know, what would that coin be? And I think here there's something about an abundance mindset as well. And then I was thinking that when Sally is talking about omnipotent thinking and how exceptions are able to transcend these conflicts, this is a transcending of the conflicts in a maladaptive way. and this would be kind of characterized by a kind of scarcity mindset. And then I was thinking about totalitarianism and how this is a sort of deletion of opposition. So this is a sort of one-dimensional world. So anyway, if you've got, so just thinking about this idea of kind of dynamic balance and harmony. So if care and uncare have their place in a healthy system, what is it like when they're in balance in a particular context, not just between themselves, but also within themselves? And when I worked as a consultant with arts organisations, I often looked at organisational values and finding out what values were deemed important, how they manifested or were experienced by different groups, different stakeholders. And to do this, I'd ask what would be happening if the value was present, what would be happening if there was too little of it, and what would be happening if there was too much of it. And I started thinking about this for care and uncare, and I haven't gotten very far with my thoughts on this. But so what would a healthy form of care and uncare look like? And is the absence of care the same as the presence of uncare? I don't know. But anyway, I kind of started just pulling some thoughts out of my arse maybe. But I thought that maybe excess care might be when there's something intrusive or suffocating about it, a kind of dependency or something. Lack of, if there's not enough care, a lack of care, is that some disconnection or isolation going on maybe? I don't know. An excess of uncare seems to me to be this realm of exceptionalism, the omnipotent thinking. Lack of uncare could be when you don't look after yourself enough, or where you lose your sense of self, or you're suppressing your needs in favour of someone else's needs. I don't know. I'm just throwing these things out there. But in Taoist philosophy, transformations can be invited, but they can also be forced upon you. So if you're pushing yourself too hard, you end up getting depleted and ill. So you're going from extreme yang to extreme yin. It's a kind of boom and bust. So what would this mean for care and uncare at both a personal and a collective level? And then I asked myself the question, could we be heading towards a forced transformation in our culture? Forced transformations aren't pleasant, so what would be the fallout if that were the case? And then I started thinking about these exceptions, the people for whom are in this extreme position, and that surely there must be consequences for them of that disharmony on a personal level. Sally's book talks a lot about the consequences ecologically and socially, but I wondered, particularly in light of this understanding that self-enhancement values are anxiety-based. We know from studies that there's an association between extrinsic goal orientation and lower subjective well-being. So according to self-determination theory, people oriented to extrinsic goals are almost invariably experience a discrepancy between their actual identity and their ideal identity, resulting in negative feelings and, in the long run, a pervasive identity deficit and maladaptation. And there's an addictive quality to pursuing extrinsic goals, because people believe the goals will bring need satisfaction and happiness, but any satisfaction that they do get is shallow and short-lived. So to cope with the feelings that then ensue of discontent and insecurity, people tend to embrace their intrinsic goals even stronger. So people can get trapped in this vicious cycle. So then I started thinking, well, how can we would be flipped from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle? So from being extrinsic goal oriented to intrinsic goal oriented. I keep getting little signs saying that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope you can still hear me okay.
Missing some tiny bits, Nadine, but,
right.
but
okay.
Keep going.
Yeah, I'm almost finished now. So this idea of kind of flipping state. So in systems thinking, this is where we look for leverage points, interventions that trigger large shifts. And from a Taoist perspective, these interventions would be uncontrived and energy efficient actions, which means they would be non-ego driven and that harness the energy and the movement of existing patterns and rhythms. So I woke up at 4:30 this morning and thought I should do a bit more work on this, because I kind of started writing it last night. And I reflected that you know, transformations from extrinsic to intrinsic goal orientation, whether forced upon us or invited, are going to hurt. But either way, it hurts. So ignoring the suffering that's motivating pursuit of extrinsic goals and the suffering that results from that pursuit, and attending to that suffering, hurts. And in recognizing and acknowledging this suffering, I thought, well, we could find compassion for ourselves, for that extrinsic oriented part of the self that others have talked about as well on the panel. And I then started thinking, well, to what extent would we want to, and would we be able to feel compassion for these who've got strong traditional tendencies towards the goal orientation? And I don't really know how a compassion like that would manifest, and I also don't know what sorts of interventions are strategically the best moves. But I do think that compassion is the key for transforming from vicious to virtual, and also for maintaining that dynamic balance within ourselves between care and uncare. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Yeah, this thing about how to feel compassion for these obsessions who are causing so much damage is, yeah, I'm just sitting with that at the moment, really. So thank you for your time, and thanks, Sally, for your book, which has triggered all these further reflections from me. I'll stop sharing now.
Hey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nadine. I clicked the wrong bit. Yeah, I really value, I mean, that the yin and the yang, and just following the thinking about how care can turn to uncare and uncare to care. And I suppose the thing about the struggle all the way through. Sally, we come to Sally, who has been in CPA from the beginning, and hearing, being part of the discussion, planning this, Sally, as a psychoanalyst in pursuit of the whodunit of our disavowal of the climate crisis, and kind of sense of the energy of that and of the inquiry. Sally edited and contributed also to the 2012 book, Engaging with Climate Change, which was personally a really important one for me, followed on from the Quaker thing, Let Us See What Love Can Do, bringing me back to this issue. Sally's also chair of the International Psychoanalytic Association's Climate Committee, which is wonderful that it exists. And on the grandparent theme, if you haven't seen it, do look at the short video produced, Corona, Climate and Grandma, which is on our website. But Sally, can I hand over to you to respond to all this thinking?
Thank you. I'm just trying to absorb so many ideas. I feel I need to sort of go away and think about them all and have a walk or something. It's tremendous, actually. First of all, I'd like to just thank CPA and everybody for this opportunity to really talk through in more detail some of what the book throws up for people, to have an opportunity to bed it down a bit. You know, I very much wrote this book as hopefully a dialogue with the reader that I had in my mind, and of course knowing that there were different readers, and hoping that the book could be co-created, a co-creation, and would spark things off. And so, sorry, I just need a glass of water. This opportunity to start to discuss it is so valuable. So thank you. I just want to respond. I won't be able to respond to what everybody said, but I did want to take up things that stay in my mind. I mean, starting because it's freshest in my mind with you, Nadine, and just want to thank you very much for raising your reflections, your getting involved with the ideas in the book from your particular perspective, which I think everybody will do, and the particular issues that you raise. I would need to think about them much further to know quite what to say. But certainly, as I understand it, when you're talking about social psychology research, I would absolutely agree with you that it's very grounded. I mean, we have the work of Tim Kasser, the really important work of Tim Kasser, Tom Crompton, you know, that whole endeavor, and obviously others. Common Cause has played a huge part in developing climate psychology. And yes, indeed, I think there are, I do make reference, perhaps not enough reference to that work. I think that there is an overlap between conceptions of extrinsic and intrinsic values with the work of care and uncare. So I think you're pointing to a need to really have an articulation with the similarities and differences, because the model that I'm coming from as well is a different theoretical model. It's rooted in different assumptions. So, but I think that that's a fascinating discussion to have. When it comes to issues of yin and yang, I would need to study that a lot more before I feel that I have anything useful to say about it. But you are introducing the idea of balance. And here I would want to say that I don't quite see the positions that I'm putting forward in quite the way that you do. Because essentially, and I describe it in the book, I think that in a caring, sustainable sense, the mind is self-regulating. It has different elements, and it strives to maintain a kind of balance. And I write about that. And I think what my focus in the book is on how particularly over the last 40, 50 years, the neoliberal era, an economy and a political ideology has sought to deregulate the human mind so that it will fit in better with its economic project. So if you like, it is seeking to unbalance the mind. And, you know, I pay quite a lot of attention to the exquisite balancing that the human mind goes in for, you know, and if there's, it tips us, if there's too much of this, it will tip us back into that and so on. But what I really was talking about is a culture of uncare that seeks to deregulate not only the financial markets, that's something that's often talked about, but actually deregulate the mind to serve its purpose. So I'm not sure that I agree with your characterization. And also, I'd like just to mention that when it comes to omnipotence, I certainly don't put omnipotence into like a scale as belonging with being an exception, whereas you know, not being an exception would be to not be omnipotent. I think from my perspective, I would say, and Hannah Siegel wrote about this really well, that actually it's a very different model I'm talking about, that the mind actually works through fantasy. You cannot not have omnipotent fantasy in relation to the mind, okay? And then it tests that against reality. It then and then it modifies its position, or it finds tricky ways to supersede reality. That's more, if you like, the sort of omnipotence that I'm talking about. But I don't see omnipotence as on one side of a scale. I think that it's absolutely inscribed into our dreams, our fantasies, our ideals. You know, it's for me, it's of a different nature. So I just wanted to pick that up. And also to say that it's a very tricky balance, actually, because I'm focusing on what I'm calling care and uncare, which I'm trying to elaborate in different ways. But in fact, you know, I think it would be problematic to make that too much of a binary. I wanted to try to reach people to see things in the big scale and to have a kind of an organizing principle. And yes, I do think it's about power. Which part of us is in power within the psyche, within our groups, in society, and so on. And there is a power struggle. But when you actually start looking at issues of care and uncare, and by care, I mean love, and Adrian amplified, you know, love and mind, and do we mind, and mind the gap, you know, and, you know, so it's love versus the forces that cause us to see ourselves, to accept ourselves from being part of a human group. But when you really go down into the nitty-gritty of these terms and these ideas, the situation is complex, of course. So I've tried to marry a situation of trying to keep the complexity while also trying to offer something that I think is simple and organizing and that actually makes sense to me. So anyway, I love the way you put it, Adrian, about reparative sleep and the issues of guilt. I think it was profound and very moving. And thank you, Paul, for saying what you said about the characterizations. It's sort of nice to have feedback that they you know they worked in a sense for you. Thank you. And Judith, thank you very much for what you said. It touches me deeply, and also the way of writing and the way of communicating, you know, and non-theoretically. I would just like to make one point about it, which is that, and also to bring in something that hasn't really been raised, which is that the book offers a dissection of exceptionalism, which is a social and political formation of being an exception, which we all have, you know, and also entitlement. And I come back to that in the conclusion, because I think entitlement is one of the most important things. It's whether, and I distinguish again between two major forms of entitlement. One is entitlement to have a life. I mean, have we got to a point now where, you know, people think that it's sort of normal not to have clean air to breathe, clean water, you know, entitlement to play a meaningful part in a group and political process, you know, this is lively entitlement. It's entitlement to what makes for a sustainable life. And I wanted to sort of beef up lively entitlement, because very often when we think about entitlement, we think about narcissistic entitlement, entitlement to being an exception. I don't have to follow the rules. I can square my conscience in magical ways. You know, I can see myself as ideal, and I can do what I like and have what I like, and I can have the lion's share, and so on. So these questions of entitlement are to do with really the will and the courage we have to pursue and make these different positions ongoing. So I just wanted to talk about, bring in entitlement, because I think it's needed as well as the analysis of exceptionalism. So I wanted to add that to what you said. Kate, if you could tell me how much time I've got, I'd be grateful, because I've been responding to what people have said, but I wanted just to say something about ecocide. So do I have a moment to do that?
Yeah, I think quickly, a couple of minutes.
Okay, good. In the book, it's really under the heading of something else that I wanted to highlight about something I do go into, and I think is absolutely critical at this time, which is the issue of frameworks of care, because we don't just care as individuals. You know, some of us are more caring than others, but we are supported by groups to care, and also by a culture of care, and we also live within frameworks of care. They support our caring side, and they actually inhibit our uncaring side. So in the book, I explore that, and I also go into Polly Higgins's seminal, profoundly important work on trying to establish a law of ecocide, because I give that as one example of a needed framework of care. It's what helps us as human beings to make us more caring, and we need to feel contained in order to do that, but also stops us when we go too far. Because I think that it's in that area that a lot more work is needed, because we've watched what we've seen as a dismantling of those frameworks, so that we've got greater division, social fracturing, and so on, to support exceptionalism. And we need building up of frameworks of care. And it's just marvelous to bring in at this moment, the new work on defining ecocide, which has literally just come out of you. If you Google new definition of ecocide and Philippe Sands, and Dio Fall, I'm sorry. Anyway, there's a co-author with Philippe Sands. They both, I'll look it up in the next break and come back with it. But it's very, very important that, so my analysis of this in the book is really trying to say, if we had a law of ecocide, that it would actually be a framework of care that would improve mental health, that it's actually not only protecting the planet, it's a mental health measure, because it would be a sign that governments actually care about us. It would give us a framework that would help us to manage our guilt at our complicity and collusion with this culture and the damage, by saying, well, there other people are much more responsible than we are. It would help us work these things through. It would stop the damage, and also, insofar as it can, because some of the damage is irreparable, it would actually replenish a nature that could then feed us, and so on. It could create more of a benign cycle. So I think this area of frameworks of care is a very, very important one that needs a lot more attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sally. And how we can have a framework of care that supports our capacity to contain, and containment as empathy and restraint, as I think you put it in the book. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for probably just under 10 minutes. There'll be different breakout rooms to reflect, I think, also the spin of ideas. My head is spinning with so much to think about. Take some time in the groups to reflect and think where we're at, and then we will come back for plenary until 12. Welcome back all. We've now got 20 minutes for our plenary, to invite some general discussion between the panel and you. There's an issue that lots of you will have seen in the chat, which is how do we give attention to the different effects of this culture of uncare, which Sally unfolds, and the issue of racism and marginalisation and people not having an equal voice is very much a result of that culture, as much as the climate crisis is. And I was in a meeting of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which had both these issues in one day, and it was really hard thinking how we can think about them together. And there's a spin of ideas today. So in a way, I suppose, I'm quoting you, Nadine, here. I hope I'm doing okay with it, but it's almost like there's nothing we can say to, satisfy this issue, to solve it today. And we know it's there, and it's painful. And and how we manage to balance between, if you like, the different pains and agonies from this. And I suppose one of the things that I deeply value from the book, and probably embody in ways that I would like not to, which is part of the problem, is the sort of moral struggle with all of this. So I'm going to ask you, please, as there are lots of us, if you can raise your hand and you want to speak, because that will then put you in order on the Zoom, so that we can take the questions in order.
Kate, can I just say that when you say raise your hand, you mean use the reaction button to raise hands?
Yes, and Sagar's done that.
Not literally raise your hand,
Yes.
but if you raise your hand, you then go to the top, and it saves having to scan both pages of participants.
Thank you, Judith. And Judith is working with me on this plenary to keep ourselves organised. So the chat is open as well if you can't get a word in. And as I say, this is part of an ongoing conversation. So we're not going to finish it today. We're not going to, and there's a spin of wonderful ideas. So, Sagar, can I ask you to speak?
This is reflecting a bit on my questions earlier, which is, every time I go into one of these climate change panels, it's not something I look for deliberately, but when we are talking about climate change, it's a global thing. So I'm always looking for where is the African person, the Chinese, or the South American person. And to get a real global perspective, even if the person is not a climate psychologist, where are the Satish Kumars, the Vandana Shivas, where are the indigenous tribes to be on the panel to speak from lived experience, right? India's 5 hours ahead, Africa's 3 hours ahead, the Chinese are about 6 hours ahead, and the Brazilians are about, 3 hours behind. You're spoilt for choice. Some people might say they're not climate psychologists. Well, actually, we've got about 5,000 years of spirituality, so, we probably win on that side as well. But my question is, as I just put in the chat, on climate change, the solutions, I'll very poignantly ask this. Why is it okay to mine the lithium for Cornwall for an electric car, but it's not okay to mine the coal from Cumbria required for the electricity to power the lithium mine and the diesel cars and the trucks? This is what's happening in India, all over India and Africa. Whole swathes of forests are deforested. Everything's removed, so it looks like a tar pit, to deliver you an electric car, a wind turbine, a solar panel. So where are we really concertedly looking to solve this when we are being so cognizant to the supply chain, which is actually going to throw us deeper into the pit of mess that we're trying to get out of? It's not tenable.
Thank you, Sagar. And I think to ask us to think about the psychology of that, and bring that psychology in. Sorry to cut you off, but I want to make sure that but thank you for bringing, earthing us in that point. Sally, you've got your hand up.
Sagar, thank you very much. Precisely. I agree with you, and it's very disturbing. And what I just want to say two short things. By the way, I said I'd come back after the break. The woman working with Philippe Sands, the international jurist, is Dior Fall So. I said I'd come back with her name. Just to say that actually, I think that the issue of the global South, global North divide of racism is absolutely at the heart of the climate struggle. I watched a video recently on Amazonas and what's going on there, which is actually ecocide and genocide. one of the comments made was, where do you see the center of your world? Is it London, Manhattan, Sao Paulo, or whatever it is? And as a result of that webinar, I actually now see the center of my world as Amazonas, indigenous people being murdered. I see it as the global south. And just very briefly, on the International Psychoanalytic Association's Climate Committee, we are very, very exercised with one of our members from Kolkata. We had to live with her going through the cyclone with water in her institute. She's a psychoanalyst, trying to rescue the books with water up to the waist, fridges floating past, and trees down, and chaos. So I just want to endorse what you're saying, and I don't think these struggles are separate. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement and this issue is actually fueling understanding of the climate crisis rapidly now. So thank you, Sagar.
Do we have more questions or comments?
Yeah. Right.
Jonathan or Sally?
Yeah, yes, me actually. I was just sort of thinking in a way that part of the issue about, why people aren't, say, concerned about the effects of lithium mining or tend to ignore it is also partly because they are kind of entrapped in a form of care and hope. They think that the lithium mining will somehow solve the problem. They think that without electric cars, without power, without solar power and all that kind of stuff, the problems continue. So ignoring the problems of generating the solution, if you like, is what produces the problem. And this why it seemed to me that Nadine's idea about the yin, the yang, the fact that the uncare contains care and the care contains uncare, is actually a really important way of conceiving it as a shortcut. That when you say, where is the hope, that is also the hope is generating the unhope. Where is the saving order? That's also what's generating the disorder. And I think that's an inherent part of Jungian psychology too, but that's a different sort of issue. So I was wondering, how on earth can we become more aware of the destruction that we generate, trying to save ourselves and trying to actually fight against the problems that we face?
Thank you. Trudy. We've got, I'm going to go for raise hands and then Trudy. Can I raise? So that would be, I think it's Linda first.
Thank you. Yes, I've been thinking as well, a lot of the climate events I go to with psychologists, psychotherapists, those in the sort of talking professions are often predominantly attended by females. And yet when we look at what's happening at COP26, there is a completely unequal balance of male decision makers going to these political events. There is a campaign running called She Changes Climate, which is trying to address this balance and force the organisers of COP26 to address this balance. And when I think about some of the rare leaders of the world in politics on climate change, they tend to be female. So I'm just wondering what other people's thoughts are about that. Is caring exclusively female? And it's not.
Thank you. Interesting. I'm going to take a series of comments together. Keep going. Elspeth and then Trudy.
Okay, mine's just a piece of information because I've recently been editing for a Pakistani women's group, and I can tell you that in this past year they do have counselling and psychotherapy, and they have done psychosocial work in small villages in the northwest of that country, which is suffering very badly. from COVID as well as climate activity. Pakistan's temperatures are as bad as Canada and the West. That's just something that I happen to know. The other thing I wanted to say was I love the comment about imaginative ideas. And I think there's a lot in novels and sci-fi, for instance. Kim Stanley Robinson, The Ministry of the Future, is absolutely brilliant. If anybody wants to enjoy something to read, which makes you think at the same time.
Thank you. Trudy.
Yeah, I was just wanting to kind of pick up on this idea of grasping for solutions like electric cars and wind turbines and so on, and thinking about the way in which the big organizations that sell these things, when you look at the sort of adverts, the advertising that you see around these solutions, it makes me think that maybe they're trying to sell us a sense of care. Like you can buy this and then you can be caring. You can show how caring you are by buying these things. And so somehow they're completely missing the point about caring. They're selling us caring, but it's not really. It's a thought that I had.
Yeah, I was really in Sally's book, the bit about advertising and newspeak, and I was noticing the slogans on the side of lorries while being driven somewhere, and they're all full of, I mean, they're weird. Good. Anyway, Murray.
Thank you very much. I'm Murray Smart. I live in Minnesota in the United States. And just a couple resources to share that I'm very concerned when I listen to Sally's book and some of the comments about the psychological impact on people around the world. And one of the resources is the myth of human supremacy, how human beings have taken the idea that we are supreme over all the other creatures and all the other things that operate in the world. And it's not going very well. Another one in the United States here, but I think it applies other places, is called Dismantling Democracy, and how the right in our country and the things they are doing to affect the people's hearts and minds. And then in terms of the race issue, one book I found really good is called Merge Left by Ian Hanley, and it talks about the race class narrative, how we frame things and how we talk about things to people makes a difference, where if we include everyone and how we speak that way, that generally speaks to everyone and they feel they're a part of the conversation rather than one group dominating and doing those type of things. So obviously there's many others, but those are some I've appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you, Murray. We've probably got time for one or two more comments, depending how long they are. Who would like to Steffi.
I really enjoyed Nadine's yin and yang kind of model, because there's a sort of, I think there's a danger to polarize and to, when we talk about corporations or the really wealthy, to, I think if we project too much just uncare onto them and don't see that they may also have an element of care, that we start to be on a slippery slope, that we do something very similar. And for me, it was lovely, and I hadn't thought about that in that way, to, you know, that it's about the integration and not seeing it in fragmented ways, even if it's just a small aspect of care. That's the thing to grow and to build on, and to see the uncare in me too. So I really liked that framing. It helped me to conceptualize something which was new for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Steffi. That's a lovely last comment to have. With one more, if it's quick, or shall we? there's so much, I feel. I mean, there's so many different bits of the book that I want to talk with people about. It's almost hard to know where to begin. Okay, so I'm going to, Delia, be our last comment.
I just wanted to make a brief comment because the comments about the frameworks of care have reminded me of the Buddhist work of Stephen Batchelor, who's written quite extensively recently and spoken about the ethic of care as intrinsic to Buddhist thoughts and creating community of Buddhists he comes from the insight meditation background. He's British, and talking about creating ethical communities that follow the precepts in Buddhism. And he interprets an ancient word, appamada, which was unfortunately translated as diligence. He retranslated it as care and sees it as absolutely central to the entire Buddhist psychology program. And I just wanted to, I think that he discusses it in his book After Buddhism, but you can probably Google it and figure out which one of his books it's in. Upaya Zen Center in New Mexico has on their website a recording of 15 lectures he gave on the topic, and it's very interesting and it meshes well with this topic that we were talking about.
Thank you. The idea of diligence is a good one.
Could I ask people just to put those links in the chat as well? That would be really helpful. Thank you. And
yes.
And Sally, could you put in the name of Philippe Sands' colleague? Because just in the chat, that's just...
Well, there's a whole group of people, but they're the two co-chairs. Yes, I will do it now.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank everybody now, in particularly Sally and our people speaking, giving the talks. And thank you also to the more than all of us from which this conversation emerges. As you go from here, I hope we can continue this conversation, which feels like it's barely begun in lots of ways. So for those in CPA, obviously we've got Zoom, Slack, the Google group, and as I said, there have been some really interesting discussions in the Google group on this. I feel you can start something to carry on the conversation. For those visiting CPA, do join us and support our work. Sally's website has got a discount code for the book. It's sallyweintrobe.com, but we can put it in the chat. I think it's always worth noticing what happens next as you go from here, what you read, what you do, what you think. I wish you all well. I kind of feel like Sally ought to have the last word, but no. Yeah, I wish you all well, and I thank you for coming, and please do keep the conversations going. And
well, yes, just to say thank you, and thank you very much for chairing so well. Thank you, and everybody.
Okay, and I will now close the Zoom, I think, and say goodbye to familiar and unfamiliar faces. Thank you very much all for coming.